How wonderful it is to be in a cozy wooden house with a roaring fireplace during the cold winter, when the room is enveloped in darkness. The flames leaping impatiently among the birch logs resemble the beacons guiding ships through stormy seas. As I add a few fresh logs, the stove begins to hum softly. Through the closed combustion chamber door, I can hear the crackling of the burning wood. I glanced at the thermometer hanging on the wooden planks outside. The temperature was steadily climbing. The red column had already reached 15 degrees Celsius and showed no signs of stopping, despite the fact that it was minus 34 degrees outside. I built this small cabin 5 years ago. I deliberately chose the most remote corner of the forest, working all summer alone, and finally brought to life something I had dreamed of for years. Some women, including my wife, simply couldn't understand why I would venture so deep into the wilderness and spend time here in solitude. But that's precisely the allure, being alone and far from people. Initially, I suggested she visit my forest retreat, but she flatly refused. Mosquitoes, solitude, cold, even with me there, she preferred glamorous social gatherings, chatty friends, and the brightly lit nightlife of the city with its advertisements. I didn't try to change her mind and accepted it philosophically as a fact. A solitary life in nature wasn't for my wife, and that was that. The cabin was located on the banks of a small river with the charming name of Hia. It was a peculiar peninsula surrounded on 3 sides by dark waters. Despite the piercing cold, the river hadn't frozen completely, and even now, in the middle of winter, I could hear the cheerful gurgling of water over the stones. I adjusted the wick of the kerosene lamp, and the room brightened. Relaxing on the moss-covered floor, I noticed that the cabin still had drafts, so I'd hung a rug on the wall, or, in my case, a hide. Right in the center of this makeshift tapestry, carefully positioned to avoid damaging the fur, hung an old but functional single-barreled 16-gauge shotgun. Honestly, I'm not a hunter. I greatly admire the subculture, but I've never killed animals for pleasure in my life. There have been instances where I had to shoot a beast, but only for self-defense or sustenance. All the furs, antlers, and even the wolf skull adorning the walls of the cabin were purchased from hunters for decoration. I'm not an ardent pacifist, and if necessary, I could defend myself against a person, but killing animals to boost my ego isn't for me. As an antiquarian, many interesting items pass through my hands, though I usually sell everything. However, when it comes to hunting artifacts, they tend to stick with me. Few people know that many hunting-related artifacts are sold at European auctions. While they don't fetch astronomical prices, some items hold significant monetary value. Much of what now decorates the walls of my cabin was purchased in Europe. I must admit, the hunting culture there is far ahead of ours. Once, I attended a hunt in the district. A group of grim men arrived with automatic rifles. The beaters drove several wild boars toward them, and they shot them as though using machine guns. Then, they skinned the carcasses, tossing the hides aside. The result was predictable: a collective binge, some questionable female company, and a terrible hangover. No romance, no battles with wild beasts, nothing. They killed, skinned, dismembered, drank, misbehaved, and left, leaving the forest in a mess. That's the extent of their hunting. At a flea market, I once came across an elderly intellectual selling an antique brass hunting horn covered in a greenish patina. The horn was adorned with genuine leather and hung from a leather cord. I was instantly captivated by it, an antique and, more importantly, a rare find. The seller asked for a reasonable price, and without bargaining, I bought the hunting artifact, the horn. It is used to call dogs during hunts, whether hounds or greyhounds. Its piercing, melodious sound carries far through the forest or across the fields. Though I didn't have dogs, I hung the horn next to the shotgun on the moose hide. I put on my sheepskin coat, which I had brought with me in the fall, and stepped outside before bedtime to breathe in the crisp air. Silence surrounded me. The silver moon brightly illuminated the snow-covered treetops, casting a shimmering path toward my house. I took a deep breath of the icy air and coughed as the frost bit into my throat. Silence. Not a single animal or bird made a sound, even the usually bold and noisy magpies seemed to have hidden somewhere. In the stillness, it felt like I could hear the branches of the trees creaking in the cold. I looked at the snow-covered fir trees and realized that winter had finally arrived. Soon, the first true frosts would come. I marveled at the twilight forest, sleeping peacefully, but for some reason, a strange unease grew within me. Morning eventually arrived. Shaking off the remnants of sleep, I climbed down from the bunk, put on my sheepskin coat, and stepped outside the cabin to scan the area for my skis. They were exactly where I had left them, leaning against the wall under the shelter. The cold had eased a bit by morning but still clung to my nose and nipped at my cheeks. I needed to leave and return home, but this required covering a 10-kilometer journey to the abandoned peat plant where I had left my car. It was impossible to bring it all the way to the cabin. Returning inside, I stoked the nearly extinguished stove and began preparing for the trip. I hid the shotgun in a concealed spot, just in case of unwelcome visitors. Who knows who might stumble upon my cabin in my absence? Locking the door, I strapped on my skis and set off on my journey. According to my calculations, I should reach the peat plant in about 2 hours. I arrived in the city by evening, trembling with a mix of cold and emotion all the way. Only when the lights of the suburbs passed did I finally begin to relax a little. When I reached the driveway, I parked the car a short distance from the main gate, not wanting to pull it all the way in. My property was large, with plenty of space. Grabbing my bag, I walked to the front door, unlocked it with the key, and entered the hallway. Silence. I turned on the light and realized there was no one on the first floor. Strange. What was I supposed to see? It was almost 2 a.m., my wife had surely been asleep for hours. For a moment, I stood and admired how the light played across the various blades hanging on the walls, authentic oriental carpets and edged weapons, all collected during my business trips. The ancient steel seemed to slumber in the pile of rugs, its deadly power hidden for now. I set down my bag and went to the kitchen. Pouring myself a glass of whiskey, I drank it almost in one gulp. Suddenly, I heard a noise. It sounded like someone shouting. Anxiety gripped me instantly. Listening more closely, I realized the strange sounds were coming from the second floor. Taking a broadsword from the wall, I climbed the stairs cautiously, avoiding the creak of my boots on the steps. At the top was the bedroom. I carefully opened the door. The light was dim, but I could see 2 figures intertwined on the marital bed. My wife, Ada, was with an unfamiliar curly-haired man. Her head was thrown back, and her voice trembled with passion, nearly shouting. Yes, yes, deeper. Oh God, this is so good. I could clearly hear her lover's voice as well, speaking rhythmically. Who are you now? Am I better than your loser husband? He asked arrogantly. Yes, yes, you're the best. I love you, she replied, her words followed by a loud moan. It was time to intervene. I coughed, and the 2 in bed finally noticed me. The lover clumsily disentangled himself from Ada and looked at me, confused. Who's that? He asked, turning to Ada, a mix of disappointment and curiosity on his face. That's my husband, Ada stammered, clutching the sheet to her chin. Ah, the husband, the man said almost cheerfully. Well, sir, go take a walk. We're not done yet. He scratched his chest and walked toward me, clearly intending to force me out of the room. His insolence darkened my vision momentarily, but I quickly composed myself. A thought crossed my mind, does he think he's invincible? For some reason, the absurdity made me chuckle. Swinging the sword, I let the flat of the blade whistle through the air, leaving a streak of blood on his face, not a fatal strike. I wasn't a murderer. The man roared in anger and lunged at me. Seeing his punch coming, I dodged and struck his jaw with the hilt of the sword. He clenched his teeth and crumpled to the floor. You killed him. Allah shouted hysterically. This and his guys will bury you. The police. I interrupted her thoughts by grabbing my phone. Hello, what's your emergency? I got a response almost instantly. A stranger broke into my house. Help. He's probably trying to kill me. I shouted into the phone, feigning hysteria. Then, I carefully placed the heavy steel poker from the fireplace into the hand of the unconscious intruder. Allah stared at me silently, her hysteria seemingly subsiding. When her lover, still dazed, was loaded into the car, a familiar captain pulled me aside. Hey, listen, this is Tomas. He runs the market. A lawyer will come tomorrow, and he'll probably be released. He's vindictive and might cause trouble. Thank you, Sergeyevich. I understand, I replied, shaking the captain's hand. When I returned to the bedroom, Allah was lying motionless, covered to her neck with a sheet. I stayed silent. I felt no more emotions, only an unbearable, burning pain inside me. Eventually, my wife began to sob, curling into a ball and trembling all over. I spoke her name, once filled with affection, now heavy with disgust. I'm leaving now. I'll sleep downstairs. Make sure you're gone by the time I wake up in the morning. She started saying something through her tears, but I didn't listen. I left the room quickly. When I woke up, Allah was still in the house. She tried to explain, begged for forgiveness, and spun tales of neglect, claiming I no longer saw her as a woman. She even dared to say she cheated out of great love for me. According to her, she would now remain faithful to me for the rest of her life. She said she had been forced, but that she loved only me. By the end of her monologue, she fell to her knees, clutching my legs, pleading for forgiveness. But something inside me had already broken. I listened to her nonsense in silence, wanting only one thing, for her to leave as quickly as possible. When the taxi arrived, Allah stood beside the car for a long time, still hoping for something. Then she got in and disappeared from my life. The next day, a stranger arrived at my house, looking every bit the lawyer. He was a young, clever-looking man with a long nose and his hair tied back in a bun, making him resemble a rat. He stepped out of a large black van and approached my gates, ringing the intercom. What do you want? I asked rudely, scrutinizing him. Mr. Kolsov, the lawyer's voice dripped with disdain, we need to talk. I don't want anything from you, I replied, waiting for his reaction. The lawyer, caught off guard, paused for a moment and pressed the intercom button again. What now? I asked, impatient. Mr. Kolsov, his tone was much more polite now, I have a matter to discuss with you. Please, let me in. I pressed the button, and the gate opened. Mr. Kolsov, Tomas Iraklievich wants to file a lawsuit against you for moral damages. However, he is a kind man and wishes to settle things amicably first, the lawyer explained, watching me closely for a reaction. I have nothing to discuss with your client. He invaded my home and attacked me. If anything, I should be the one filing charges. I smirked arrogantly. Your wife invited Tomas Iraklievich. He was her guest, after all. This is her house too, the lawyer insisted. This house belongs to me. She's not even registered here. So, it's clearly a case of illegal trespassing. I looked directly into the lawyer's eyes. I should have shot your Tomas. Tomas Iraklievich doesn't agree, the lawyer replied stubbornly. He wants to meet with you and discuss compensation for his injuries. I have nothing to discuss with him. Now, leave. I stood, signaling that the conversation was over. The lawyer left silently, but I knew this was only the beginning. Later, my phone rang. The number was familiar. I'm listening, I answered quickly. We have an order. Are you home now? The voice was direct. Yes, come over. A middle-aged man with a slight bald spot entered and sat in front of me. I need antique Oriental silver. The region doesn't matter, preferably from the 15th to 17th century, he said, sipping from his glass. Coins, jewelry, or utensils? I asked. Both, he replied with a smile. Preferably from Afghanistan or Central Asia. India works too. He set his glass down. So, are you interested? What's the price? I asked, feeling slightly tense. This was a complex order in an unstable region. The client named a sum that suited me perfectly. When's the deadline? I asked again. There's no specific deadline. As soon as possible, but don't rush, he replied. Agreed. But I have some personal matters to settle here first. I poured another drink for both of us. Need help? My guest asked, crossing his legs. Seems like it, I admitted, taking a sip of whiskey. Then I began explaining my predicament. Life, it seems, barely gives you time to recover from one blow before delivering another. It's like walking through a dense forest, blindfolded, at night. You're afraid to open your eyes suddenly, you might run into a branch and lose an eye. So, all your hope lies in your hands. You shield your face with one hand and reach out with the other to avoid hitting a tree trunk with your forehead or nose. Have you ever seen a children's carousel? Everything moves in circles, horses, reindeer, goats, they all return to the starting point, then begin again, endlessly. Perhaps the animals on the carousel think they're moving forward, but in reality, they're just running in a closed loop. Life feels the same way. Events repeat themselves with an almost enviable consistency. Someone once said life is a spiral, unfolding progressively. Unfortunately, that hasn't been the case for me. Years ago, I fell in love with a girl who crossed my path by chance. Her name was Sandra. Just saying her name stirs a bittersweet ache within me. So many years have passed, yet I can't forget her. I thought she felt the same way about me, but perhaps that was just my illusion. I had to leave urgently at the time, there was a matter I couldn't postpone. I left her the keys and asked her to wait for me. She promised she would, no matter how long it took. She spoke beautiful words about love and fidelity. But when I returned, she was gone. The only thing in the mailbox was the house key. Nothing else, no message, no goodbye. She hadn't even left a note. I searched for her for almost a year. I quit my job, enlisted all my friends, and used every connection I had. But Sandra had disappeared without a trace. I checked every morgue, hospital, psychiatric ward, and prison, but it was all in vain. In a drunken haze, I even convinced myself she might have come from outer space, there simply seemed to be no other explanation. After another year, I slowly got back on my feet. I never thought it was possible to love someone so deeply, especially someone so ordinary. Sandra wasn't particularly striking in appearance or exceptionally charismatic. She was just a simple, ordinary girl, the kind you see everywhere. Yet, without her, life felt hollow. But time passed, and gradually, her image began to fade. Life, as always, dictated its own terms. Eventually, I started to return to some semblance of normalcy. Orders began coming in again, and where there's money, women inevitably follow. That's how Allah came into my life, a young and beautiful party girl. She clung to me like a vice. We met at a celebration, I can't even recall what it was for. I wasn't actively seeking women. I poured my own drinks, gradually getting drunk. I had just returned from another business trip the day before, with money in my pocket. Drunk, I was searching for an excuse to leave as soon as possible. The shallow conversations and superficial crowd were unbearable. At some point, a young woman landed beside me. Without unnecessary chatter, she skillfully poured wine into my glass, making sure to serve herself too. "Why are you so sad?" she asked after we shared a drink. I shrugged. I didn't feel like talking. A handsome guy like you, all alone, she persisted. And nosy too, I muttered. This was going to be tough, that was my first thought. I had no desire to engage in flirtation or any kind of dance of courtship. But the girl didn't give up easily. Seeing that her attempts to charm me weren't working, she switched tactics. What a silly party, she began, filling my glass again. It feels strange being alone in a crowd. Then why don't you leave? I muttered. Call a taxi and go. My phone's dead, she replied, looking at me hopefully. If you want, I can help you, I said. Those words turned out to be fateful, though I didn't realize it at the time. A few more glasses of wine later, I found myself sitting in a taxi with her. She wasn't clingy or overly forward. She sat elegantly beside me, like a caring friend. Later, I discovered she had conveniently forgotten her money. I paid the driver and offered to let her repay me later. It all seemed scripted, as if the debt couldn't wait to be settled or even forgiven. By then, I was quite drunk and struggling to perceive reality. The next morning, I woke up in bed with Allah. I didn't feel any disgust. Well, if it hadn't been Allah, it would have been some other woman, it didn't make much difference. 2 months later, we got married. The wedding was small but elegant, with important guests and a few family members. We moved into my house. The property, the store, and the antiques business, all of it was mine. We didn't sign a prenuptial agreement, but even without one, she couldn't claim anything except the car I had gifted her, which was a mere drop in the bucket. We didn't have children, Allah wasn't in a hurry, and I didn't insist, as I had a feeling about something. Meanwhile, my wife immersed herself completely in high society, friends, parties, and gatherings. Yet, there were no signs of infidelity. She always came home on time, her phone was always on, and no one raised doubts about her behavior in public. And then came the affair with the market director, Tomas. Honestly, I couldn't understand why. I was younger than her lover and denied her nothing. We spent almost every evening together. What was she missing? I didn't dive too deeply into the moral and psychological aspects of marital life. Women, they're impossible to understand. They say even they don't fully understand themselves sometimes. But the fact of the infidelity was as clear as day. Of course, I was upset, but not like when Sandra disappeared. This time, it was a mix of pain and confusion, a dull ache in my heart and soul. It was as if I had discovered that I'd been living with an empty person for years, pouring my affection into someone who was hollow inside. They say there's a very thin line between love and hate. Maybe that's true. I was more than surprised when I realized that the love I still felt for Allah was just a fleeting ember, quickly extinguished in the days that followed. In the end, single life suited me better. I filed for divorce and began preparing for a trip south. But it wasn't that simple. Allah decided to claim half of my business and the house. It's well known that lawyers can accomplish almost anything, for a hefty fee. My ex-wife didn't have that kind of money, so her lover got involved. It's hard to say what motivated them, but it certainly wasn't love. It was more likely a desire for revenge, to humiliate me, and perhaps even to strike back after I bruised Tomas's face. 2 days later, a lawyer representing Allah contacted me, informing me that they were filing a lawsuit for the division of property. I understood that legally they had no chance, so they would resort to other methods of persuasion, and I had a feeling I knew what those methods might be. A week later, Allah's cunning lawyer arranged a meeting to discuss what he called the disputed matters. As expected, my lawyer was present, not so much to assist me, but to serve as a witness. It seemed the meeting was designed to pressure me into sharing my assets and wealth with the poor abandoned woman. I decided to play dumb to better understand their devious plans. Allah outdid herself, dressed entirely in black, she looked somber, wearing a veil as if mourning our destroyed family. She acted as though it was all my fault. Her lawyer did most of the talking. He went on about Allah's unfortunate situation, how she had made mistakes, and about the need for forgiveness. Finally, he got to the point, sweetly proposing that I divide my business and other assets as compensation for the best years of my wife's life that she had spent with me. His smirk left no doubt in my mind about what would happen if I refused. I sat silently, blinking occasionally, pretending to be a complete fool. Even my lawyer shook his head doubtfully and tried to argue with the rat, but Allah's lawyer quickly silenced him and turned back to me expectantly. I stood up, shook off my passive demeanor, and said just one word, no. When I left the meeting room, I saw out of the corner of my eye the rat dialing someone on his iPhone. That night, 2 burly men arrived at my house, accompanied by the lawyer. My security guard escorted them to my office. The fact that I had security at my house seemed to catch the cunning lawyer off guard. He hadn't expected such resistance from me. But he quickly got to work. He spent almost an hour trying to scare me with all sorts of consequences for my refusal, though he avoided making any direct threats. I endured his tirade and eventually sent him on his way. From everything I'd heard, I understood that I needed to strike preemptively and put an end to this circus. I looked at my watch. It was nearing midnight. The owner was late. Silence. His family was visiting their homeland, ensuring no interruptions. I shifted in the armchair, feeling the urge to smoke, but the smoke would give me away. There was nothing to be done. I'd have to forego the cigarette for now. The sound of a car approaching broke the stillness. Finally, the front door slammed shut, followed by the echo of heavy footsteps. The door opened, and a bulky figure in a black coat stormed into the room. I saw Tomasa's hand groping for the light switch. "There's no need to turn on the lights," I said, my voice carrying the weight of judgment, like an angel on Judgment Day. The large man froze, then slowly turned to face me. "Who are you?" he managed to stammer, his voice thick with confusion. "A horse in a coat," I quipped, unable to resist a joke. "Sit down. Let's talk." I gestured to the chair opposite me. Tomas understood my gesture and cautiously sank into the chair, gradually regaining his composure. For the next 20 minutes, I listened as he lectured me on my sins, breaking into his home, daring to cross him. He even tried calling security, but no one answered his desperate cries for help. Then it was my turn to speak. My monologue was brief and to the point. I won't recount every word, but the essence was this: if he ever crossed my path again, I'd cut off, not what you're thinking, but his head. As I said this, I switched on the floor lamp. Tomasa's eyes widened as he saw it. On the coffee table before him lay the severed head of his beloved dog, Hector. Blood seemed to ooze from the marble-like replica, making it appear freshly decapitated. Hector had been as rotund as his owner. You should have seen the terror in Tomasa's eyes. He looked like he had swallowed his tongue in fear. The silence stretched for about a minute before Tomasa's phone rang. With trembling hands, he pulled it out. I swiftly snatched it from him and put the call on speaker. Someone, panicked and frantic, reported that the food warehouses were on fire. I looked at Tomas. His terror was palpable. It seemed I had made my point. I could have gone further, blown up his car for dramatic effect, but that would have been overkill. I stood up and walked away, leaving Tomas to admire the head of his beloved pet. As I walked down the dark hallway, I had to step over the unconscious bodies of his security guards, sprawled in awkward poses after being knocked out with a stun gun. 2 shadowy figures emerged from the wall. "Let's go," I said softly. "Like a dog sleeping without its hind legs," murmured one of the men in black with a wry smile. "Did you think I killed the dog?" I asked. "Of course not. I love animals. But admit it, a fake rubber head can leave quite an impression." The divorce proceedings went smoothly after that. I was alone in court, and the entire process took little time. For a successful business trip, preparation is key. I scoured the internet and visited the library. Not everything you need can be found online. Wikipedia is little more than a giant virtual dumpster, filled with unverified garbage. But I didn't need unreliable data. My life was at stake, and there was no room for error. On a freezing winter night that felt endless, I set aside Geller's reference book on antique Oriental silver and indulged in a Cuban cigar. I sank into the corner of an old leather sofa, the dim lamp casting a sharply defined circle of light on the floor while the rest of the room remained in semi-darkness. Outside, frost crackled, and the fluffy snow on the flower beds gleamed like silver under the still full moon. I didn't feel lonely. There was always something to occupy me, especially as I prepared for another expedition. Truthfully, I didn't want company. To my neighbors, I was a mystery. I disappeared for long periods and reappeared without warning. They had no idea what I did, and that was for the best. The less they knew, the better they slept. Exhaling a plume of smoke, I set the unfinished cigar in an antique brass ashtray. Rising from the sofa, I walked to the kitchen, poured a 3-finger glass of whiskey, dropped in a few ice cubes, and took a long sip. At that moment, the intercom buzzed. The old ship's clock showed it was already 11:30 p.m. I wondered who could be visiting at such a late hour. Reluctantly, I approached the intercom. On the dimly lit screen, illuminated faintly by a street lamp, I saw a woman standing near my gate. She was dressed in a dark coat with a scarf wrapped around her head, covering her up to her eyes. She didn't resemble anyone I knew. "Who are you looking for?" I asked into the intercom microphone, taking a sip of whiskey. "I need to speak with the owner," the woman responded clearly, resting her gloved hand on the brick fence. I had more questions, but suddenly I felt pity for keeping a stranger out in the cold. I unlocked the gate. From the security camera, I watched the woman slowly make her way to the front porch, swaying slightly. "She's drunk," I thought. She climbed the steps with some effort and stood in front of the main door. "Hello, may I come in?" she asked softly. "Come into the hallway," I said, leading her inside and closing the door behind her. No, she didn't seem drunk. In the well-lit hallway, the woman hesitated, her large blue eyes scanning me with curiosity and a hint of caution. "Take off your coat and scarf," I offered. The stranger removed her faux fur coat, lightly dusted with snow, revealing a plain wool dress that hugged her petite, well-proportioned figure. She unwound her worn scarf and looked around for a coat rack. Regaining my composure, I politely took her outerwear and carefully hung it. She then removed her boots and stood there, looking at me expectantly. For a moment, I lost my ability to speak. Before me stood a charming young woman. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why was she here? These questions swirled in my mind, but I couldn't find any answers. I had very few female acquaintances in this city, certainly none this captivating. I stood silently for a moment, trying not to meet her gaze. The pause felt endless. "Please, have a seat," I finally said. "I'll prepare some tea." The young woman walked into the living room, looking around curiously. She paused by the rug displaying my collection of weapons, silently examining the deadly steel hidden among the pile. Then she turned to me, smiled faintly, and finally sat on the sofa, smoothing out her dress. Leaving my guest in the living room, I went to the kitchen. I heated the kettle, poured boiling water into a teapot, found some cookies, and arranged everything neatly on the coffee table. The woman took a cup carefully, sipped politely, and then looked at me. "So, how can I help you?" I asked courteously. "Are you Edward Calov?" the stranger asked, placing her cup back on the saucer. "That's correct," I replied, adopting a refined tone, feeling strangely eager to impress her. "And you are?" "My name is Galina." "Galina Berezovsky," she said. Her blue eyes locked onto mine. "Do you remember Sandra?" I choked on my surprise. "Sandra?" My heart betrayed me, pounding uncontrollably. Love can change a person. It can lie dormant, waiting for the right moment to make your heart race again. But time had changed me, new thoughts, passions, sorrows, and joys had replaced the old. Occasionally, I missed the person I used to be, but it was impossible to turn back the clock. There was no point in trying. Lighting a cigarette, I opened a small window. Outside, the frosty winter night was bathed in moonlight, and the snow shimmered like silver. Inside, the room was warm, the fire crackling in the corner and occasionally sending sparks into the air. Yet, a chill ran down my spine. "Forgive me, but, how old are you?" I asked tactlessly. "Does it matter?" Galina shrugged, her unwavering gaze still fixed on me. "You haven't answered my question yet." She looked at me intently, and I held her gaze. "Yes, I remember Sandra," I said finally. "She lived here for a while and then disappeared without leaving a note," I said, leaning back in my chair. Memories of Sandra brought pain. I had searched for her, but it was all in vain. "That's all," I added, making it clear that I didn't plan to bare my soul to a stranger, not even one as charming as Galina. The young woman hesitated, as if deciding whether to continue. "You couldn't have found her," she finally said, struggling to find the right words. "Before she met you, Sandra was dating a man named Arthur. They were about to get married, they even had rings. But then she met you, and Sandra lost her mind. She fell in love with you. When you left, she waited patiently. But then your housekeeper, her aunt, showed up. I don't know what happened between them, but she kicked Sandra out, and she had to go back home." Galina paused, then continued. "Arthur found out she'd returned, tracked her down, and beat her severely. Her family mistreated her too, calling her names like city socialite. One day, Arthur came to her house again and proposed to her. Sandra had no way out, so she accepted. When she discovered she was pregnant, she believed it was Arthur's child. For almost a year and a half, they lived together somewhat tolerably. But then Arthur started examining the baby, trying to find some resemblance to himself. Doubt crept in, and he became convinced the child wasn't his. He did a DNA test, and the truth came out. That night, he beat Sandra again, calling her horrible names like monster and tramp. He took all her valuables, including her engagement ring, and continued to abuse her almost daily. She couldn't take it anymore. One day, when Arthur was at work, Sandra took the baby and went to live with me, her cousin. I was renting a room in a shared apartment at the time. Arthur didn't try to find her. A month later, he filed for divorce, and Sandra didn't contest it. We lived together for almost 2 months. Sandra didn't work, so we survived on my salary. But money was catastrophically scarce. Sandra decided to go to the capital to find work. She left the baby with me, saying she had no other choice since she had nowhere to go. Before she left, she told me about you and that the child was yours. I managed to buy her a ticket to Kiev with the little money I had. Later, Sandra wrote to me, saying she'd found a job as a waitress in a cafe. There, she met Valdez, a student taking his final exams. Valdez started courting her, sweeping her off her feet with promises of marriage. He even suggested taking her to Latvia to meet his parents. After that, I never heard from Sandra again. There were no more letters. I don't know where she is now or what happened to her. But why didn't she come to find me? I almost shouted. Especially if the child is mine. She knew I had returned. She did come to find you, Galina replied calmly. But she was greeted by a young woman who introduced herself as your wife. That woman drove Sandra away and threatened to call the police if she came back. Galina sipped from her cup. When Sandra married Arthur, she changed her last name, which is probably why you couldn't find her. I sat in stunned silence for a moment. Where is the child now? I finally asked, regaining my composure. She's with me, Galina said, sighing heavily. I left her with a friend to keep her out of the cold. Galina covered her face with her hands and began to cry. Honestly, I was in shock. I had no reason not to believe her, everything she said made sense. What do you want from me? I asked Galina. I just need some money, she said quickly. Just enough to get through this difficult time. We'll go home, and you won't hear from us again. Galina spoke quickly, as though afraid I'd throw her out. I was promised a job, she added but didn't finish the sentence. I understood there was no job in sight. Are you hungry? I asked unexpectedly. What? She replied, startled. Are you hungry? I repeated. She looked at me in surprise. Let's go to the kitchen, have a bite to eat, and then we'll go get Vera, I said. I called a taxi, and we headed to the outskirts of the city. Galina's friend rented a room in an old, poorly heated house buried under a pile of clutter. There we found a little girl who clung to Galina, wrapping her tiny arms around her neck. I'm hungry, the child whimpered softly. Galina gently stroked the girl's head. I tried to lift Vera, but she screamed in fear and clung even tighter to Galina. When we returned home, Galina helped me prepare dinner, as I had no idea what a small child could eat. Afterward, I showed them to the bedroom and tucked them in for the night. The next morning, I woke up early, made coffee, poured myself a large cup, and sat in the kitchen. Overnight, I had made a decision. Now, I was just waiting for Galina to wake up. Did I believe her? Yes and no. At the very least, I had decided to get a DNA test. That would determine where we went from here. I didn't call my mother, she was already busy with my niece, Katia, and I didn't want to worry her. Galina entered the kitchen. I poured her a cup of coffee and pushed a plate of toast toward her. As soon as Vera wakes up, we'll leave, she said, adjusting her dress. Thank you. Tears welled up in her eyes again. Why do women always cry at the drop of a hat? I thought. Very well, I replied. As for your work, it's hard to predict what will happen. In any case, we need to feed and clothe the child. If you don't mind, I'd like to hire you as a housekeeper. You'll live here with the child. Consider the money I gave you as an advance. I placed a card in front of her. This is for groceries and clothing. Buy whatever you and the child need. Do you have a mobile phone? Galina shook her head. I pushed a box with a new iPhone toward her. Will you manage on your own? I asked. She nodded quickly. My number and the driver's number are already programmed into the phone. If you need to go anywhere, just call, and he'll pick you up. Once Vera wakes up and has breakfast, we'll go to the lab to do the DNA test. I'll be leaving soon, and I want to know the results before I go. I said all of this in one breath. Any objections? Galina shook her head. 6 days later, the DNA test results were ready. I wasn't the child's father. Galina read the results and looked at me. Oh my God, what do we do now? She said helplessly. Don't think we'll leave right away. I'm so sorry. I never thought this could happen, I was sure Vera was your daughter. She placed the card on the table and went upstairs to fetch Vera. Wait. I said firmly, slamming my hand on the table. What's changed all of a sudden? I still need a housekeeper. Besides, I might be away for a while. By the way, Elizabeth Pavlovna is coming today. She'll stay with you while I'm gone. You and the child will be fine. Galina looked at me, astonished. So. I can stay. She stammered. Of course. You work for me. Everything stays the same. I chuckled. Yes, history repeats itself, I thought. Years ago, I said goodbye to someone I loved and asked her to wait for me. The circle is complete. As I was about to get into a taxi, Galina asked to accompany me to the airport. I didn't object. While I was checking in for my flight and heading toward passport control, Galina unexpectedly kissed me on the cheek and whispered, "Come back soon." After passing through immigration, I turned back. Two figures, one large and one small, were waving at me. I could see tears in Galina's eyes. After a 6-hour flight, the plane landed safely at an airport in one of the Central Asian republics. As soon as I completed all the post-flight procedures and entered the arrivals hall, my eyes caught a familiar face in the dense crowd. It was Oleg Beck. There was no doubt he had come to greet me. I raised my hand to signal that I'd seen him. "Salamu alaikum, brother," Oleg greeted me warmly, dressed in a long camel wool tunic and a traditional tubatika. He embraced me tightly. "Long time no see," he exclaimed. "Hello, Oleg," I replied, genuinely glad to see him. "I have a car," Oleg said, picking up my bag. We headed toward the airport exit. After weaving through the narrow streets of the ancient southern city, our car finally entered through a set of narrow gates and stopped under the shade of a porcelain tree. A young woman quickly set the dasturkan on the ground, covering her face as she bowed, then disappeared into the house. Oleg said something to her in a language I didn't understand. She bowed again and disappeared inside. "Did you get married?" I asked, looking at the woman and then turning to my friend. "No. Why would you think that?" Oleg replied with a laugh, throwing off his robe casually onto a pile of cushions. "But I'm not that old, am I?" "Let's not delve into that topic," I said as we settled around a low table covered with a colorful cloth. The young woman served hot dumplings and quickly disappeared into the house again, ever polite and efficient. We spent a long time eating, washing down the meal with aromatic tea. Oleg inquired about the health of my loved ones and was deeply saddened when I told him about the circumstances of my younger brother's deaths. "Did you get your revenge?" he asked solemnly. "Yes," I replied succinctly, as is customary for a man. My friend nodded approvingly. The sun began to set, and the warm southern glow slowly dipped below the horizon. The heat started to subside. Soon, we heard the call to prayer, the adhan, echoing through the air. It seemed there was a mosque nearby. While Oleg Beck performed his evening prayers, I managed to drink 2 cups of aromatic tea. As night fell completely, the silent woman lit several lanterns, illuminating our resting area amidst the surrounding darkness. The loud chirping of cicadas and the whisper of bat wings reached our ears. "Nearby are the ruins of an old tower," said Oleg Beck, as if reading my thoughts. "There are many bats there. They hunt at night and sometimes fly all the way here." Finally, we got down to business. I briefly explained the essence of my problem to my friend without going into too much detail. There was no need to burden a good man with unnecessary information, especially since he would have to handle the task anyway. "There's no point in going to the bazaar," Oleg commented, chewing his lips thoughtfully. "Anything of value has already been taken. Crossing the river is dangerous, the local warlords are rampant there. They've even started causing trouble for the Americans and will soon take control of the entire region. We should head southeast to the Yarra Valley. There might still be something to find there." I nodded in agreement. There were very few caravan trails left in the region, so it was unlikely anything of worth could be found near the river. But the Yarra Valley might hold coins or silverware, just what I needed. "I'll look around here, too," Oleg continued after a pause. "Maybe I'll find something. Take my car, equipment, weapons, and head southeast. Tomorrow, you'll pick up your car, documents, and firearm permit." He called out into the darkness, and a light turned on near the gate. "Let's go inside, you need to rest," he said, motioning toward the house. The silent woman led me to a small room with a bed and a nightstand. On the table was a copper basin and a pitcher of water. She gestured toward the bed and said something. I nodded in acknowledgement, though I didn't understand her words. She said another short phrase before leaving. I undressed and lay down, reflecting on the events of the past few days. Too many had piled on at once. I was awakened by a faint creak and the soft touch of a hand. Before I could ask who was there, a gentle, perfumed hand covered my mouth. A light, delicate presence settled next to me. The woman kissed me and caressed me tenderly. I was too surprised to resist, and it all happened without objection. The warm southern night, filled with the allure of the Orient, cast its spell. When the young woman, now vulnerable and open, embraced me, there was no disappointment, only a sense of calm, as though a heavy weight had been lifted. For the first time in a long while, tranquility settled in my soul. I fell asleep holding her close, her quiet breathing a soothing melody in the night. I woke to the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Outside, Oleg Beck sat beneath a chinaberry tree. "You slept well," he remarked, his gaze piercing as though reading my thoughts. "It seems so," I replied, trying to discern the deeper meaning behind his words. "That was Amina," he said. "She's the widow of my friend Baisim. Her husband disappeared in the desert about a year ago. Fortunately, they had no children. She lives here now and seems to have taken a liking to you." Oleg added something in his native language, and I lowered my gaze, unsure of how to respond. In the end, it was her choice, I thought. We had another cup of coffee before Oleg handed me a large canvas bag. Inside, covered with a mesh shawl and accompanied by a magazine, was an AKSU rifle. 2 fully loaded magazines sat beside it. "3 should be enough," Oleg commented. "You're not going to war." The bag also contained a long, broad-bladed knife and an old artillery binocular, wrapped in desert-patterned camouflage fabric. At the bottom of the bag, I found a familiar Colt 1911 pistol along with a spare ammunition clip. "Your documents, provisions, and everything else are in the car. You can sort it out later," Oleg said, standing up. "May Allah protect you." The ornate door creaked open, and Amina appeared. Ignoring Oleg, she ran to me and embraced me tightly. As I left the city, the haunting call of the muezzin resonated in the distance. The car sped along the sunlit road, slicing through the red sands into 2 almost equal halves. The road followed an ancient caravan route. In the old days, it had been a lifeline for traders and travelers. Now, the thermometer on the dashboard read 47 degrees Celsius. The engine strained, pushing itself to its limits. The temperature gauge crept steadily toward the 100 degrees Celsius mark. I sat in the driver's seat, dressed in a warm robe over a bathing suit, the only way to escape the oppressive heat, even briefly. Occasionally, mountain peaks appeared on the horizon, but I could no longer tell if they were real or just a mirage. This road was slowly dying. Fewer and fewer vehicles crossed the desert. The asphalt withered under the scorching sun, and the remaining gas stations rusted away at the roadside, abandoned relics of a time when this route thrived. The heat consumed everything living, expanding the vast desert further and further. Its sand stretched all the way to the Aral Sea. I recalled how Oleg Beck had once told me about his childhood, when gardens bloomed in these parts and rivers flowed abundantly. Those days were long gone, and now the only source of moisture was the brief seasonal storms, losing their battle against the relentless, scorching heat. The sun sank mercilessly toward the horizon, the dry air still clinging to its fiery grip. Desert winds swept over the dunes, casting hot sand onto the road. As the day came to an end, I realized I'd have to spend the night in the car. The only comforting thought was that the setting sun would bring cooler air, allowing me to breathe more easily. The crimson sun nearly touched the horizon as I pulled over and reclined the seats. I unrolled my sleeping bag, retrieved a portable gas stove, and set up a kettle. I had no appetite but was tormented by thirst. Quickly lighting the stove, I placed the brass kettle on top and filled it with tea leaves. In such heat, the locals preferred strong green tea, called Coca-Cola chai. While the tea brewed, I pulled the rifle from my bag, chambered around, engaged the safety, and set it on the seat beside me. There were no signs of habitation for miles in any direction. I felt as though I were in outer space, yet one had to be prepared for any unexpected encounter. Soon, I sat on the car hood, wrapped in a camel hair blanket, sipping hot tea to quench my thirst. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew, and clouds began to gather, darkening the sky. A streak of lightning lit up the horizon, followed moments later by a thunderclap directly overhead. I watched as raindrops fell from the sky, prepared to retreat into the cabin if necessary. But the downpour never reached the parched earth, it evaporated in midair. Only a few hot droplets managed to hit the ground, landing on my face as if mocking me. The wind flung a handful of sand into my eyes, and the clouds slowly drifted northward. One by one, the stars began to twinkle, forming constellations that seemed meaningless against the vast night sky. I struggled to fall asleep. Thoughts swirled in my mind, but eventually, fatigue took over. I was startled awake by a noise and the car shaking violently. My eyes snapped open, and I stared into the impenetrable darkness outside. What could it be? A snake, perhaps. But how large would it have to be to shake the car like that? A wave of black panic and uncontrollable fear overwhelmed me. My body felt paralyzed. I breathed deeply, almost hysterically, arching my back in an effort to regain control. With incredible willpower, I forced myself to search for a flashlight and switched it on. The trembling beam of light pushed back the darkness, revealing the same lifeless desert around me. I sat there, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as though it would burst. Gradually, I began to calm down. The panic subsided, and my racing thoughts slowed. I wiped the sweat from my face with the sleeve of my robe and took a deep breath. Maybe it was just a dream, I tried to reassure myself while scanning the desert with the dim light of the flashlight. I noticed something black dissolving quickly into the darkness. Remembering the rifle, I placed it beside me. It was small caliber, but sufficient for defense. I also had the Colt .45, a compact but powerful pistol. Holding the weapon in my hands helped me regain my composure. I took a sip of whiskey for courage and sat silently, listening intently to the night. More noises came from nearby, the faint hiss of sand shifting and scattering, but the car remained still. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep again. They say that in the most desolate sandy regions of Central Asia lives the algua corcoi, a red worm-like creature about 1 meter long. It surfaces only during the hottest months. The local population has a mystical fear of this creature, believing it can kill from a distance, either by spitting lethal venom or delivering an electric shock. The legend of the algua corcoi is so widespread and consistent that it likely originates from a rare and endangered animal, possibly a relic of ancient times surviving in the remotest corners of Central Asia. Here, in the Red Sands, as Oleg Beck once told me, locals still claim to have seen the algua corcoi. He mentioned that the creature only appears in June and July before burrowing back into the ground to hibernate. The locals were convinced the creature hadn't vanished and continued to take human lives occasionally. Several expeditions were sent to search for the algua corcoi in the remotest areas of Central Asia. In 1954, American scientists operating in the Inner Mongolia region abandoned their settlement and 2 Land Rovers, disappearing without a trace. At the request of the U.S. government, Mongolian authorities organized a search. The missing people were eventually found in a remote part of the Gobi Desert. The vehicles were in good condition, but 6 corpses lay nearby. Due to prolonged exposure to the sun, the exact cause of death couldn't be determined. It was suspected they were victims of the algua corcoi. In the 1970s, 2 Soviet expeditions ventured into the Red Sands to attempt to capture the elusive creature. They failed to catch it but gathered numerous pieces of evidence supporting its existence. The results of these expeditions were never published and were soon forgotten, except by the locals. I opened my eyes abruptly, greeted by the faint light of dawn. It still seemed early, but the oppressive heat had already given way to the coolness of the night. I tried to recall the dream, but it had already slipped away, leaving behind a lingering sense of unease. As I continued deeper into the desert, the road began to deteriorate. The lifeless landscape on either side of the highway was deeply disheartening. According to my calculations, I should reach my destination by nightfall. The Gamar Valley lay between the mountains, which had already appeared faintly on the horizon. In the distance, my eyes caught sight of a white speck. I stopped the car and retrieved my binoculars. Through the shimmering heat rising from the asphalt, it was difficult to make out, but it appeared to be a vehicle. There didn't seem to be anyone around. I decided to approach. There was no way to bypass it, sand surrounded the area, and my car could easily get stuck. The closer I got, the more alarms rang in my head. Something wasn't right. To be cautious, I took the rifle and released the safety. It was a white Toyota, its nose buried in a mound of sand that had blown onto the road. Inside the cabin, a man sat motionless, his head slumped over the steering wheel. His left arm hung limply by his side, while his right arm was obscured. To the left of the car, almost in the middle of the road, lay a woman dressed in jeans and a t-shirt. She showed no signs of life. It seemed as though she had been trying to escape from something. The question was, why had she jumped from the car? Perhaps she was trying to get away from the driver. I didn't rush to turn off the engine or get out of the car. My mind was racing, analyzing the situation. How long had they been here? No one had passed me on the road, so they must have been here before I arrived, at least a day. In such heat, rigor mortis sets in more slowly, but it was clear these bodies weren't fresh. They looked like they had just stepped out of a shower. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the driver's limp hand twitch slightly. My doubts shattered like fragments of a grenade. It's an ambush. I shifted into first gear and simultaneously lowered the right window. The car jolted forward as I maneuvered around the woman lying on the ground. One thought raced through my mind: don't get stuck in the sand. With my right hand, I raised the rifle and fired a short burst directly at the driver. I saw the bullets pierce his body. He convulsed a few times like a puppet on strings before collapsing out of the cabin. It seemed he was truly dead now. A pistol fell from his right hand onto the sand, though I couldn't identify the model. From the left side of the road, an automatic burst shattered the air. I heard bullets slam into the side of my car. Pressing the accelerator, I pushed forward, but my worst fear came true: the car stalled, trapped in a sand drift. I opened the left door and rolled onto the sand, returning fire as I moved. A hail of bullets rained down nearby, some grazing my left forearm. I felt the blood trickle, but my arm was still functional. It meant the wound wasn't serious. Bracing myself against the car, I aimed toward the source of the gunfire. Despite the pain, I steadied the rifle and fired another burst in the attacker's direction. I had no idea how many bullets remained, and there was no way to reach my spare magazine. My options were dwindling. All that remained was silence. The only sound was the crunch of sand under heavy boots. Leaning against the car, I gripped the rifle and waited. It had become a deadly game: who would make the next move? Finally, I saw a shadow emerge from behind the car, the sun shining brightly behind them. The sand crunched, and a head wearing a baseball cap appeared. My rifle bucked as I fired the last round. The lifeless body of the woman collapsed at my feet, the same one who had been lying motionless on the road minutes earlier. I froze, expecting another attack, but everything remained silent. Slowly, I climbed back into the driver's seat and turned the ignition. The engine started instantly, as if nothing had happened. I carefully reversed, steering slightly to the right, and drove through the sand until I was free of the drift. Once I stopped the car, I treated my wound. It stung, but I had to endure it. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but I gave myself an anesthetic injection just in case. I didn't touch the bodies. In a few days, they'd be gone. There were too many dead out here to dwell on it. I searched the Toyota but found nothing of value. The three figures now lay lifeless in the sand, giving no signs of life. I picked up the gun that had fallen from the driver's hand, a Beretta 96. A good weapon. I tucked the trophy with its full magazine behind my belt and returned to my car. Soon, the desolate desert landscape stretched out on either side of the road again. After about 60 kilometers, I spotted some buildings ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was an old caravanserai, miraculously preserved. I drove quietly under the arch and into the courtyard, where a small fountain had once stood in the center. I stepped out of the car and walked into the shade of one of the arches. There was no one in sight. If anyone was here, they were likely hiding from the scorching sun inside the buildings. The courtyard was well maintained. Where the walls were cracked or chipped, someone had reapplied fresh clay, which had dried quickly under the relentless sunlight. I looked around the buildings, but there was no sign of people. Perhaps no one lived here permanently, maybe they only visited occasionally. The question was, why? As an inn, these structures were no longer useful. Maybe it served as a staging area for something. In one of the rooms, I found several old jars, most of them made of clay, but a couple were silver. I tossed them into the car and continued driving, determined to reach the valley by daylight. Eventually, the road led me into the mountains, winding between rocks until it reached a babbling mountain stream. The air became cooler, and instead of dunes, there were trees lining the path. I realized I had arrived at my destination. An hour later, I entered a small village. Surprisingly, there was electricity, and more importantly, a bazaar. That's where I planned to go the next morning. I stayed at a small hotel, proudly named Hotel. The room had a shower and a toilet. What more could a traveler want? I ate some dry rations and collapsed into bed, exhausted. The trip had been more than successful. Besides fulfilling the order, I had also purchased something for myself. The next day, after refueling the car and filling 2 extra gas cans, I began the journey home. I had to spend another night on the road, but it was peaceful. By the end of the second day, I was pulling into Oleg Bek's courtyard. He didn't greet me empty-handed either. I handed over everything I had brought. The delivery wasn't my concern, specially trained people took care of that. When I told Oleg about my adventures, he clicked his tongue repeatedly, expressing either approval or condemnation of my recklessness. We drank chai, and I went to bed. After spending the night in Amina's arms, I left for the airport the next morning, accompanied by a friend. I didn't say goodbye to Amina. As they say, long farewells bring tears. I carried with me a few coins and some amusing trinkets I had found in the abandoned caravanserai. Oleg Bek and I hugged in silence. In his eyes, I saw a silent question. I knew what it was. Yes, I like her very much, but I am a wanderer, a lifelong vagabond. It's better not to have a family for now. He extended his hand, and after some hesitation, I removed the talisman my grandfather had given me from around my neck and handed it to Oleg. Give this to Amina as a keepsake. My hometown greeted me with cold wind and unpleasant spring rain, a stark contrast to the places I had just come from. No one came to meet me because I hadn't told anyone I was returning. I picked up my car from the underground parking lot and drove home quietly. In the 2 weeks I'd been gone, most of the snow had melted, leaving piles of blackened slush along the roads. The roads had frozen overnight, and my car skidded on the icy patches, splashing water. The windshield wipers rhythmically swept the rain off the glass. I lit a cigarette and blew the blue smoke out through the slightly open window. I felt a deep sadness. Too many women had been around me lately, yet for some reason, memories of the last one lingered in my heart. Amina. Yes, she was the one who had captured my heart. But sadly, I would never see her again. Most likely, Oleg Bek would marry her off to some respectable gentleman. All I could do was wish her happiness. An hour later, I entered the ring road, and before long, I was pulling up to my house. When I tried to unlock the front door, the key didn't work. Strange. I recently changed the lock, and everything was fine. Frustrated, I got out of the car and pressed the intercom button. After a long journey, I was tired and only wanted a drink of whiskey and some sleep. "What do you want?" an unfamiliar male voice answered. I was momentarily taken aback. "I need to get into the house," I said dumbly. "Wait a minute." The door opened, and a middle-aged man stood in the doorway. "What do you want?" "The owners are still asleep." "Get out of here," he said, trying to slam the door in my face. But my brain went into automatic mode. I regained awareness when the guard flew sideways, hitting his head against the brick fence. Yes, you can't beat skill. I carefully stepped over the man's legs, crossed the path, and headed toward the front door. The door was open. I entered the hallway and carefully set my bag down next to the sofa. Who were these supposed owners? I hadn't rented or sold the house. Could Galia and her little scheme have reappeared? I wasn't angry, just surprised. I walked into the kitchen. The fridge was mine, but the tea set wasn't, too bright for my taste. I didn't like it. I opened the cabinet, finding the dishes all mixed up, mine and someone else's. The antique brass pieces, which had looked so beautiful behind the glass, were gone. I made myself some coffee and returned to the hall, deciding to wait until the owners woke up. I must have fallen asleep because I didn't hear them come in. "Hey, who are you?" a loud voice jolted me awake. A man in a satin green robe loomed over me, his eyes wide with surprise. Beside him stood a young woman with long fingers and blood-red nails, furiously typing something on her iPhone. "I'm in my house," I said loudly. "Who are you?" Who? "We bought this house and moved in 3 days ago. The owner and her kid went north with her husband and sold us the house." The man was practically boiling with righteous indignation. "The owner?" "A young woman named Galia, and the child's name was Vera, about 4 years old." I asked, the pieces falling into place. I realized what had happened. Galia. I even recalled her tearful farewell at the airport, "Come back soon." She had been playing me the entire time. She acted fast, selling the house and pocketing the money. The whole thing was so banal that I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. It's true what they say, you shouldn't let strangers into your home. I could almost picture her laughing at me as she disappeared with the cash. Without a word, I walked into the study. Pushing aside the painting hanging on the wall, I opened the hidden safe and pulled out the deed to the house. I returned to the hall and handed it to the man. "Here you go. The house has one legal owner, me. I'm not married. I'll give you an hour to leave. I'm done with this." I turned and began sorting the dishes, putting them back where they belonged. "We bought this house, and we're not going anywhere. You leave. If you have a problem, take it to court." The man was shouting now, his voice trembling with anger. "Mina, did you call the police?" he added, turning to the woman. "Well," I muttered to myself, "I've done everything I could." I stood up, grabbed the man by the nose with my right hand, and, without hesitation, tossed him out the door and into the street. He landed in a puddle, splashing rainwater as he struggled to get up. I turned to his wife. "Out," I said flatly. She leaped outside nimbly, rushing to help her husband to his feet. I didn't feel sorry for them, they didn't seem poor. They'd figure something out. As I was heading back inside, a police car pulled up in front of the house. Unfortunately, it wasn't the couple they were after, it was me. The sergeant, covered in acne and grinning maliciously, even punched me a couple of times in the stomach for good measure as they dragged me into the car. At the station, I presented the house documents to a high-ranking official in civilian clothes. He read through the papers slowly, his lips moving as he silently deciphered the contents. Finally, he sighed and said, "This is a matter for the courts to decide. You had no right to evict the current occupants by force and abuse them." I didn't comment on his words but asked to make the one phone call I was entitled to. Quickly, I dialed the number. On the other end of the line, they listened intently before disconnecting. About half an hour later, the office door burst open with a bang. The chief sitting across from me jumped in surprise as a man in a cream-colored suit strode into the room. His presence was commanding, and he quickly scanned the room. "Arad Reisman, attorney for Mr. Kalev," he announced casually, nodding toward me. "What grounds do you have for detaining my client?" The chief began to stammer something, but the attorney cut him off. "The legal owner of the house is my client, as confirmed by these documents." The lawyer's voice filled the office. "Mr. Kolzov doesn't need to prove what's already obvious. You must release my client immediately." "But he assaulted the victim," the chief tried to interject. "The victim here is Mr. Kolzov. The people who attempted to seize his house should leave immediately and pray to God that Mr. Kolzov doesn't sue them for stealing his property." The lawyer waved a document like a flag. "You should send a squad immediately to clear the house of these intruders." A true professional, I thought. It was like he was speaking to the living dead. As I exited the station, accompanied by the lawyer and the police captain, I noticed a familiar acne-covered sergeant standing near the patrol car. "Just a moment, gentlemen," I said. "I have a little business to take care of." I approached the sergeant and knocked him out with a single punch to the jaw. His head slammed against the side of the police car as he crumpled to the ground, his cap askew. When I turned back, rubbing my bruised arm, both the lawyer and the captain were conveniently looking the other way. The music came in waves, almost knocking me over. I sat at the bar and poured myself a third glass. The bartender gave me a sympathetic look, his eyes silently offering another one. I nodded. Suddenly, a painfully familiar face appeared in the mirrored shelf behind the bar. I sobered up instantly. Sandra. I turned quickly. She stood nearby, a slender, foreign-looking man with her, his arm wrapped casually around her waist. To be honest, I was a little confused. Sandra didn't see me, and something told me not to call out to her just yet. I turned back toward the bartender. He nodded knowingly, as if he had seen through my hesitation. Slowly sipping my whiskey, I kept an eye on Sandra and her companion. She was dressed expensively, wearing a lavish gold necklace that sparkled around her neck. As an antiquities dealer, I could recognize value at a glance. It was a costly piece. So, my ex seems to be doing quite well for herself. But if everything's fine, why isn't her daughter, Vera, with her? Why is she with that con artist, Galia? Strange. If everything's so perfect, why hasn't Sandra taken her back? Or maybe Vera isn't her child at all. The thoughts, heavily laden with alcohol, rattled through my head. I couldn't decide whether to approach Sandra or let her be. What if Galia was somehow involved? The music suddenly stopped, leaving my ears ringing. I glanced at the mirrored bottles again. Sandra was no longer reflected there. She and her companion had moved to a table in the alcove. A waitress stood at their table, speaking to Sandra's companion. He got up and walked toward the restrooms. Now or never, I thought. "Hello, my love," I said softly. Sandra turned her head sharply, startled but recognizing my voice instantly. "May I sit down?" I asked. She stared at me for a moment, then nodded nervously, glancing around as if searching for her companion. "What's wrong? How are things?" I asked calmly, keeping my voice low. "How are things?" she echoed. It was clear she didn't know what to say to me. "How's your daughter? Have you taken her away from that friend of yours?" I asked gently. "What daughter? I don't have any children. Leave me alone." My husband will be back soon, Sandra stammered, glancing around anxiously. Who is Vera? My voice rose slightly as anger bubbled beneath the surface. Who is Vera? Leave me alone. Sandra's face turned red as she snapped at me. Her response hit me like a slap. This is the woman I've been dreaming of for years. I had built a fantasy of supernatural love around her, but the truth was banal and cruel. She didn't owe me anything. Suddenly, I felt nothing but disgust. I was about to get up when someone grabbed me from behind by the neck. Sandra's eyes widened in fear. No, Valdez, she screamed. I was yanked from my chair and slammed to the floor, my head hitting the ground with a thud. As I tried to regain my bearings, a sharp kick landed on my right leg. Despite my drunken state, my reflexes kicked in. I grabbed my assailant, a wiry, foreign-looking man, by the arm and yanked him toward me. He collapsed to the ground, taking the tablecloth and dishes with him. Now there were two of us on the ground, sharing an awkward, silent moment. But it was time to finish this farce. I got up as quickly as I could, wobbling slightly, and made my way toward the exit. As I passed the bar, I glanced through the glass window and saw the jealous man running after me. Frankly, I was getting tired of fighting with him. I let him get close, then stepped to the right and landed a punch squarely on his eye. He fell backward, his head bouncing off the small staircase leading to the restrooms. At that moment, the pitiful squeal of the music was drowned out by a surge of crazy decibels. Why does it feel like I'm always getting hit? I felt so sorry for myself that I even wiped a tear from my cheek. In the restroom, I looked at my reflection in the mirror with a mix of sympathy and self-pity. There wasn't even anyone around to feel sorry for me. On the taxi ride home, I sobered up a little, and that was no good. Once home, I went to the kitchen, grabbed a bottle from the cabinet, and collapsed onto my favorite sofa with a sigh of relief. That's when I realized I wasn't alone in the house. Lifting my head, I spotted someone quietly sitting in the shadowy hallway. It was an older man with gray at his temples. How did he get in? That was the first thought that crossed my mind. This is no place to drink alone, the unexpected guest said suddenly. He pulled a collapsible plastic cup from his coat pocket and snapped it open with a flick of his wrist. I can get a glass, I muttered. No need, the man smiled. This one's better. I poured him some whiskey, and we drank in silence. How's the whiskey? He asked, frowning slightly. Worse than our moonshine. We sat quietly for a while until the man got down to business. You had a very productive trip to Central Asia. The client was extremely satisfied. He lit a thin cigarette without asking permission. But you'll need to go back there again. I looked at him curiously. Another job? A small one, but very well paid, he said, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. Silver again? I asked, slowly coming back to myself. No, not silver. Something else. Your story about the elusive worm in the red sands impressed a very wealthy man. He wants that trophy. I nearly choked on my drink. But I didn't even see it. That's just speculation. That's for you to find out, whether it's mysticism or reality. The guest stood up. The fee will be, he named a sum so large that my vision momentarily darkened. When do I leave? I asked, all doubts erased by the promise of such a reward. For that amount of money, I was ready to trek back to Central Asia on foot. A man you know well will contact you. He'll provide the necessary instructions, equipment, and clothing. When will he contact me? Take your time. Everything in due course. The guest buttoned his coat. Wait, I have a favor to ask, I said, standing up. Yes. He looked at me with curiosity. I told him about the recent events at my house and my suspicions about those involved. He listened carefully before asking, and what do you want? To take the money back from the thieves. No, I replied, holding his gaze firmly. It's not my money. They can keep it as their fee. I'm interested in the child. Who is she, and where is she now? It's not right to give a girl hope and then take it away. Very well. I'm listening, the guest said, cutting me off before I could continue. And the thieves? Do whatever you want with them, I said. The man nodded, turned, and disappeared through the front door. Recently, I placed a vintage radio in my office, manufactured in the 1950s. I had taken it from my mother, who had persistently complained about the abundance of old junk cluttering her house. It was a beautiful tube radio, still in excellent working condition, originally purchased by my grandfather and passed down to me as a sort of heirloom. Now, it sat proudly in a vintage cabinet to the left of my desk, its flawless design a pleasure to behold. People in the past certainly knew how to make things. Time flies quickly, and now even radios from the 1960s are becoming antiques. The demand for vintage technology has grown. Enthusiasts often contact me about tape recorders from the late 1980s or early video equipment from the 1990s, VHS players, analog camcorders, and cassette recorders. 30 years ago, we believed this equipment was the pinnacle of innovation. Now, even DVD players are considered outdated relics. It seems every generation eventually feels nostalgia for the past, consciously or not, and begins to seek out items that bring them back to a simpler time. Although vintage radio equipment isn't my primary focus, I've been thinking more and more about opening a dedicated department in my shop. I believe this niche in the antiques business has real potential. Settling into my armchair, I pulled out a half-empty bottle of Yemeni liquor from the bottom drawer of the table. I poured 2 fingers of the amber drink into a glass. What else was there to do? If you have a radio, you have to listen to it. I glanced out the window. It was snowing, a rare sight for April. Large flakes struck the glass like frozen butterflies, as if they were trying to force their way into the warmth of the lit fireplace. I got up and closed the window. Finally, a sentimental French melody from the 1960s drifted from the speaker. It was a beautiful time, even though I only knew it from old magazines and films. I closed my eyes, letting nostalgic images take shape in my mind. Deciding to inspect the items I'd brought back from my last trip, I pulled 2 bundles from the desk drawer and placed them neatly in front of me. One contained an ancient dagger, its handle sheathed in tarnished silver. When I drew it from its scabbard, the blade felt perfect in my hand, as though it had been crafted for me in another lifetime. The other bundle held a small figurine of a creature resembling a cat, carved from an unknown material and painted in bronze. Its open mouth and sharp features were striking, but what made it exceptional were the eyes, skillfully inlaid with rare black amethysts. Hundreds of intricate carvings covered its surface, bringing the beast to life. I placed the statuette on the mantelpiece and left the dagger on the table. Perhaps someday, I'd hang a handmade antique rug in my study and display the dagger alongside it. As I drifted off to sleep, I imagined the beast on the mantel gnashing its teeth, its voracious gaze fixed on me. The next morning, I received a text message with an address. I rewrote it quickly and prepared to leave in a minute. Lighting a cigarette, I stared at the wall for a long time. Life doesn't teach me anything, I thought bitterly. I always get involved in the wrong business, and I always end up the same, burdened with a mix of gratitude and hatred. I was about to take on a responsibility I'd carry for the rest of my life. But what lies on the other side? There is no other side. Who is this girl to me? What is she to me? I can't save and nurture everyone, that's just life. And there's nothing I can do about it. Besides, where would I even put her? I live alone, and I don't have a nanny. That thought brought me some relief, and for now, I felt I had made the right decision. One thing was clear to me now: most women, regardless of their age, are monstrously ungrateful. My car bounced along the dirt road, occasionally plunging into shallow puddles, the wheels breaking through the thin ice. It was bitterly cold from the night before, but it was clear that spring had finally defeated the long, dreary winter. In an hour, the sun would warm the earth, the ice would melt, and the road would become an impassable swamp. Soon, a dilapidated one-story house with walls blackened by time and rain appeared around the bend. I pushed open the rickety door and stepped into the dark, musty hallway. The place seemed abandoned, but voices coming from one of the rooms suggested otherwise. I approached a plywood door leading to one of the rooms and turned the knob without removing my gloves. A stench of rot and alcohol hit me like a wall. Inside, at a table cluttered with leftover food and empty bottles, sat a half-dressed woman, her head resting on her crossed arms. Two scruffy men were loudly arguing about something. When I opened the door, every one of these colorful characters turned to look at me in surprise, even the woman, who sluggishly raised her head. "What do you want?" croaked one of the men, his unbuttoned coat draped over his shirtless body. "Where's the girl?" I asked loudly, trying not to breathe in the unbearable stench. "Oh, Vera. She was here yesterday," slurred the man, clearly nursing a horrific hangover. He nudged the woman. "Hey, what's going on?" "Where's the girl?" the woman muttered, her swollen, drunken eyes struggling to focus on me. Ignoring her, I scanned the room. Someone shifted under a tangle of rags on an iron bed against the opposite wall. One of the men nodded toward the pile. "There she is," he said. From beneath the filthy rags, Vera crawled out, weak and listless. She didn't even have the strength to cry. It was obvious these fools hadn't bothered to feed her in days. I gently picked up the child. She instinctively nuzzled into my coat, like a kitten seeking warmth. "Leave her alone," the woman protested, attempting to stand, but her legs gave out, and she collapsed back onto the stool. "I'm taking the girl," I announced, my voice cold. "What do you mean you're taking her?" the first man snapped. "We've fed her, clothed her, raised her, and for what?" "Nothing." I threw some cash onto the table. "Is this enough?" Their greedy eyes lit up at the sight of the bills. Without waiting for a response, I wrapped Vera securely in my coat and carried her to the car. I placed her carefully in the back seat and asked softly, "Do you remember me?" She nodded.